The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi. As Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood rigid against the Pacific wind, it was June 4th, 1942, and the fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy's supremacy hung in the balance like the morning mist that would soon burn away under the scorching sun. The Admiral's weathered hands gripped the rail as he surveyed the most formidable naval force Japan had ever assembled for a single operation, for aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. And here you formed the heart of the Kido Butai, the mobile, striking force that had brought terror to Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. Their decks bristled with Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters and Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, each aircraft a testament to Japanese engineering prowess and pilot skill. The carriers were escorted by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Creating a steel wall of protection around the precious flat-tops, Commander Matsuo Fukuda, the same pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, prepared his aircrew for what they believed would be another crushing victory. The intelligence reports suggested that the Americans had only 2 carriers in the area, Enterprise and Hornet, while the Japanese brought 4. The mathematics seemed simple enough. Overwhelming superiority in numbers and experience would surely carry the day. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of this grand strategy, had wagered everything on this single throw of the dice. From his flagship Yamato, positioned hundreds of miles behind the striking force, he had orchestrated a complex plan designed to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. The capture of Midway Atoll would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and potentially force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace. But unknown to Yamamoto and his commanders, the Americans had cracked the Japanese naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, knew exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. He had positioned his forces accordingly, turning Yamamoto's trap into a counter-ambush of devastating proportions. According to declassified naval intelligence documents from the National Archives, the code-breaking operation known as Magic had given the Americans unprecedented insight into Japanese battle plans. The first wave of Japanese aircraft launched at dawn, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that echoed across the fleet. 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers, 36 Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters formed up in perfect formation before heading northeast toward Midway. The remaining aircraft were kept in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for the anticipated naval engagement. As the strike force disappeared into the morning haze, Nagumo felt the familiar tension that preceded battle. The intelligence reports had been reassuring, but something nagged at the veteran admiral. The Americans had been unusually quiet, their radio transmissions minimal. In his experience, such silence often preceded a storm. The first indication that something was amiss came at 7:28 in the morning, when the cruiser Tone's reconnaissance aircraft reported spotting American ships northeast of Midway. The pilot's initial report was vague, mentioning only 10 enemy surface ships without specifying their composition. This ambiguity would prove fatal to Japanese hopes. As precious minutes ticked away while commanders debated whether the spotted vessels included aircraft carriers, the stage was set for one of the most decisive naval battles in history, where the hunter would become the hunted, and the rising sun would begin its long descent toward defeat. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's voice crackled over the radio. From his Kate bomber, high above Midway Atoll, "There is need for a second attack," he reported, his words sealing the fate of the Japanese fleet below. The first strike had damaged the airfield installations, but the runways remained operational, and American aircraft continued to launch from the Coral Stronghold. Admiral Nagumo faced the most critical decision of his career. His reserve aircraft, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship warfare, stood ready on the flight decks. The reconnaissance report from the Tone's aircraft had been updated. The American ships included at least one aircraft carrier designated as Yorktown class. The admiral's staff urged caution. arguing that the American naval force posed a greater threat than the weakened Midway garrison. But Tomonaga's urgent request weighed heavily on Nagumo's mind. The pilot was a decorated veteran, and his assessment carried significant weight. More importantly, the failure to completely neutralize Midway would leave Japanese transport ships vulnerable to land-based aircraft when they attempted to land invasion forces. The specter of defeat haunted every decision. At 7:15, Nagumo made the fateful choice that would echo through history. He ordered the rearming of the reserve aircraft, switching from anti-ship weapons to bombs suitable for ground targets. The order unleashed a frenzy of activity as aviation ordnancemen rushed to swap weapons, creating a dangerous accumulation of ordnance on the flight decks. The process was time-consuming and hazardous. Torpedoes had to be carefully lowered into the hangar decks while bombs were hoisted up from the magazines. Fuel lines snaked across the decks as aircraft were topped off for the second mission. The carriers became floating powder kegs, their decks cluttered with ammunition and aviation fuel. At 7:45, just as the rearming operation neared completion, another report arrived from the Tone's reconnaissance aircraft, enemy force, accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The cryptic message sent shockwaves through the command structure. The presence of an American carrier changed everything, transforming the tactical situation from a simple ground support mission to a deadly game of naval aviation. Nagumo's face paled as he grasped the implications. The American carrier could launch strikes against his force, while his own aircraft were trapped in the rearming process. He immediately countermanded his previous order, demanding that the aircraft be rearmed once again with anti-ship weapons. The flight deck crews, already exhausted from the first weapon change, began the dangerous process anew. The confusion was compounded by the return of the first strike force. Low on fuel and some carrying battle damage, Tomonaga's aircraft needed immediate recovery. The flight decks, already cluttered with ordnance and fuel hoses, now had to accommodate incoming aircraft. The carefully choreographed ballet of carrier operations devolved into barely controlled chaos. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu watched the confusion with growing alarm. His crew worked frantically to clear the flight deck, but the accumulated delays had created a tactical nightmare. The Americans, wherever they were, had been given precious time to organize their own attack. Every minute of delay was a minute the enemy could use to close the distance and achieve surprise. The first American attack came at 8:20, launched from Midway's surviving aircraft, obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters and Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers approached the Japanese formation with desperate courage. The attacking aircraft were systematically destroyed by the superior Zero fighters, but their presence confirmed what Nagumo had feared. The Americans knew exactly where he was. As the debris from the American aircraft settled into the Pacific, lookouts reported more contacts on the horizon. The battle was about to escalate beyond anything the Japanese had anticipated, and their moment of maximum vulnerability was approaching with the inexorable certainty of fate. The radar scopes aboard the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown painted a picture of devastating opportunity. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the Enterprise, studied the reports with the calm precision that had made him one of the Navy's most respected tacticians. The Japanese carriers had been located northwest of Midway, exactly where the intelligence reports had predicted they would be. At 702 hours, Spruance made the decision that would shatter Japanese naval supremacy. He ordered the immediate launch of all available aircraft, even though the range was at the extreme limit of his plane's capability. The gamble was enormous. If the attack failed, his carriers would be defenseless against the inevitable Japanese counterattack. But the opportunity was too perfect to ignore. The Enterprise and Hornet began launching aircraft with mechanical precision. Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters roared off the flight decks in the largest carrier strike the U.S. Navy had ever attempted. 116 aircraft from the two carriers formed up in the morning sky, their silver wings catching the sunlight as they headed northwest toward their rendezvous with history. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the overall American force from the Yorktown, delayed his own launch to keep his aircraft in reserve. The damaged carrier, hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea, represented the Americans' final ace in the hole. Her aircraft would be held back until the tactical situation became clearer. The first wave of American attacks began arriving over the Japanese fleet at 9:25. The obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet made their approach at low altitude, their slow speed and predictable attack pattern making them perfect targets for the circling Zero fighters. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his 15 aircraft in a suicidal charge against the carrier Soryu, knowing that survival was unlikely, but hoping to create chaos in the Japanese formation. The slaughter was methodical and complete. The Zeros, flown by veteran pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience, tore through the American formation with devastating efficiency. One by one, the Devastators fell into the sea, their crews becoming casualties in what appeared to be a futile gesture. Only one aircraft from Torpedo Squadron 8 survived the attack, and its pilot, Ensign George Gay, would spend the next several hours floating in the Pacific as a witness to the unfolding drama. The attack by Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise fared little better. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's aircraft approached the Japanese carriers from a different angle, but they too were intercepted by the deadly Zero fighters. The American torpedo bombers, designed in the 1930s, were no match for the Japanese interceptors in speed or maneuverability. As the debris from the American torpedo attacks settled into the Pacific, the Japanese began to feel a dangerous sense of overconfidence. The American attacks had been beaten off with minimal damage to the Japanese fleet, while the attackers had suffered catastrophic losses. Admiral Nagumo's staff began to believe that American naval aviation was as inferior as their intelligence reports had suggested. But the torpedo attacks had accomplished something their crews never lived to see. The Japanese fighter cover had been drawn down to sea level, chasing the low-flying torpedo bombers. The combat air patrol, so effective against the Devastators, was now out of position to intercept the next wave of American aircraft, approaching from high altitude. High above the Japanese fleet, the dive bombers of the Enterprise and Yorktown had finally located their targets. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, had been flying search patterns for over an hour when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer heading northeast. Following the ship's course, he discovered the Japanese carrier formation just as they were most vulnerable. The stage was set for the 5 minutes that would change the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese carriers, their decks loaded with armed and fueled aircraft, sat beneath a clear sky with their fighter cover scattered and ineffective. The hunters had become the hunted, and the American dive bombers began their deadly plunge toward the heart of the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's voice cut through the radio, static with deadly precision. "Attack immediately! Attack immediately!" The words echoed across the scattered American formations as 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise pushed over into their attack runs. The time was 10:22 on the morning of June 4, 1942, and the next 5 minutes would determine the fate of the Pacific War. The Japanese carriers spread below them like a collection of deadly toys, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. The Akagi, flagship of the Kido Butai, presented the most tempting target. Her deck was packed with Nakajima B-5 and Kate bombers, their engines warming up for the planned strike against the American fleet. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck like mechanical serpents, and ordnance carts stood ready to arm the waiting aircraft. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading the Enterprise's bombing Squadron 6, selected the Akagi as his primary target. His SBD Dauntless screamed downward through the thin air, its perforated dive brakes creating a distinctive whizzing sound that Japanese sailors would remember for the rest of their lives. The dive bomber's 1,000-pound bomb fell away at 1,500 feet, its trajectory calculated with deadly precision. The bomb struck the Akagi's flight deck near the center elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck below before exploding. The blast ignited aircraft fuel and ammunition, creating a chain reaction of secondary explosions that gutted the carrier's interior. Within minutes, the flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack force was transformed into a blazing inferno. Her career as a fighting ship effectively ended. Simultaneously, the dive bombers from the Enterprise's bombing Squadron 14 screamed down toward the carrier Kaga, the massive converted battleship. Her flight deck, crowded with aircraft and ordnance, presented an even more vulnerable target than the Akagi. The first bomb struck near the island's superstructure, while subsequent hits walked across the flight deck, igniting everything they touched. The explosions aboard the Kaga were even more spectacular than those on the Akagi. The carrier's aviation fuel storage tanks caught fire, sending towering columns of black smoke into the tropical sky. Secondary explosions rocked the ship as her ammunition magazines detonated, lifting aircraft and men into the air like toys. The ship's damage control efforts were hampered by the loss of electrical power and the destruction of her fire main systems. At almost the same moment, the dive bombers from the Yorktown's bombing Squadron 3 were making their own attack on the carrier Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie led his 17 aircraft in a textbook attack that would have made their instructors proud. The Soryu, smallest of the Japanese carriers, was caught in the middle of launching her own aircraft when the American bombs began falling. The first bomb hit the Soryu's flight deck, forward of the island, penetrating to the hangar deck and igniting parked aircraft. The second bomb struck amidships, destroying the carrier's central elevator and trapping aircraft in the hangar below. The third bomb hit aft, near the stern, rupturing fuel lines and starting fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. Within 20 minutes of the attack, the Soryu was abandoned, her crew taking to the life rafts as their ship burned behind them. Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge of the blazing Akagi, watched his carefully constructed battle plan disintegrate. In the space of 5 minutes, the three carriers represented the heart of Japanese naval aviation, their experienced air crews and aircraft irreplaceable assets that had taken years to develop. The loss of even one carrier would have been a significant blow. The loss of 3 in such a short time was catastrophic. The Japanese fighter cover, drawn down to sea level by the earlier torpedo attacks, was caught completely off guard by the high-altitude dive bomber assault. The Zero fighters, so effective against the low-flying Devastators, were climbing desperately toward the diving SBDs when the bombs began falling. Their failure to intercept the American dive bombers would haunt Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war. As the American aircraft pulled out of their dives and headed back toward their carriers, they left behind a scene of unprecedented destruction. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks twisted and their crews fighting for survival. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been reduced to scrap metal in less time than it took to brew a pot of tea. The rising sun, which had seemed so ascendant just hours before, was now setting on Japanese hopes for naval supremacy in the Pacific. The hunters had become the hunted, and the course of the war had been changed forever by 5 minutes of perfectly executed naval aviation. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, as pillars of black smoke rose from his 3 sister ships. The acrid smell of burning aviation fuel and exploding ordnance drifted across the water. Like the scent of defeat, his carrier, operating independently several miles north of the main formation, had escaped the devastating American dive bomber attack that had crippled the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The Hiryu represented Japan's final hope for salvaging something from the disaster. Her flight deck still functioned, her aircraft were intact, and her crew maintained their fighting spirit despite the catastrophe unfolding around them. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the aggressive commander of Carrier Division 2, had already made the decision to strike back at the Americans with everything he had. At 10:58, 18 Ichi D-3 Aval dive bombers, escorted by 6 A-6M0 fighters, launched from the Hiryu's flight deck. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike force toward the American carriers, their location betrayed by the returning dive bombers that had savaged the Japanese fleet. The Americans had revealed their position by their attack. Now they would pay the price for their audacity. The Japanese strike force found the American Task Force 17 at 11:57. The carrier Yorktown, her flight deck busy with landing operations, presented a perfect target. The ship's combat air patrol had been reduced by the morning's operations, and her defensive gunfire was hampered by the need to avoid hitting her own aircraft. In the landing pattern, Lieutenant Kobayashi's dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs with the same precision that had made Japanese naval aviation feared. Throughout the Pacific, the first bomb struck the Yorktown's flight deck near the island's superstructure, penetrating to the hangar deck and starting fires among the parked aircraft. The second bomb hit amidships, destroying the carrier's central elevator and rupturing her uptake system. The third bomb, perhaps the most damaging, struck the Yorktown's stack, knocking out her boiler rooms and reducing her speed to a crawl. The great carrier, which had survived the Battle of the Coral Sea and rushed to Midway for this decisive engagement, began to list as her crew fought to control the damage. Thick black smoke poured from her wounds, and her flight operations came to a complete halt. But the Yorktown's damage control parties, trained in the hard school of Pacific combat, refused to give up. Captain Elliot Buckmaster and his crew fought the fires with desperate efficiency, restoring power and gradually bringing the ship back to fighting trim. Within 2 hours, the carrier was making 20 knots and launching aircraft once again. Her resurrection a testament to American engineering and SEAMANSHIP. The Japanese, observing from long range, believed they had sunk an American carrier. This intelligence failure would prove costly when Admiral Yamaguchi ordered a second strike against what he believed were the 2 remaining American carriers. At 12:45, 10 Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched from the Hiryu for what would be the final Japanese offensive of the battle. The second attack found the Yorktown just as she was recovering from the first assault. The Japanese torpedo bombers, approaching at low altitude in the face of intensive anti-aircraft fire, pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, flooding her engine rooms and causing a severe list that made further flight operations impossible. This time, the damage was beyond the capability of the Yorktown's repair crews. Captain Buckmaster ordered the ship abandoned, and her crew took to the life rafts as their ship settled deeper into the Pacific. The Americans had lost their first carrier of the battle, but the cost to the Japanese had been devastating. They had expended their remaining aircraft and revealed the location of the Hiryu. Admiral Spruance, commanding the American Task Force 16, wasted no time in organizing a counterattack. The Enterprise and Hornet, their flight decks busy with rearming and refueling operations, prepared to strike back at the last Japanese carrier. The hunt was on, and the Americans possessed overwhelming superiority in aircraft and position. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the Battle of Midway entered its final phase. The Japanese, reduced to a single carrier and a handful of aircraft, faced the combined might of 2 American carriers and their full air groups. The mathematical equation that had seemed so favorable to Japan at dawn had been completely reversed. By the events of the day, the rising sun was setting on Japanese naval supremacy, and the Hiryu stood alone against the gathering storm of American vengeance. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pacific as 24 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise climbed toward their attack altitude. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, leading the strike force, had spent the better part of 2 hours searching for the elusive Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier. The hunt had been complicated by false contacts and communication failures, but now the enemy ship lay exposed beneath the clear sky. The Hiryu, her flight deck cleared of aircraft, steamed alone in the vast Pacific with only her escort destroyers for company. Captain Tomio Kaku had positioned his ship for maximum maneuverability, knowing that the American attack was inevitable. His remaining aircraft were either destroyed or too damaged to fly, leaving the carrier defenseless except for her anti-aircraft guns and the skill of her helmsman, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi. The fiery commander who had pushed for aggressive action throughout the day stood on the carrier's bridge with grim determination. The loss of the 3 other carriers had not broken his spirit, but he understood the mathematical reality of the situation. The Americans possessed overwhelming superiority in aircraft and position, while his force was reduced to a single ship with no offensive capability. At 5:03 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Gallagher's dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs. The SBD Dauntless aircraft screamed down through the thin air, their perforated dive brakes creating the distinctive whizzing sound that had become the signature of American naval aviation. The Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, creating a web of tracers and exploding shells. But the American pilots pressed their attacks with deadly determination. The first bomb struck the Hiryu's flight deck forward of the island's superstructure, penetrating to the hangar deck and igniting the remaining aviation fuel. The second bomb hit amidships, destroying the carrier's central elevator and starting fires that quickly spread throughout the ship. The third bomb struck aft, near the stern, rupturing fuel lines and ammunition storage areas. The explosions aboard the Hiryu were less spectacular than those that had destroyed her sister ships, but they were equally fatal. The carrier's damage control systems, already strained by the day's operations, were overwhelmed by the spreading fires. Secondary explosions rocked the ship as her remaining ammunition detonated, and the flight deck began to buckle under the intense heat. Captain Kaku fought desperately to save his ship, but the damage was too extensive. The Hiryu's electrical systems failed, her engines stopped, and her hull began to settle deeper into the water. The carrier that had launched the final Japanese attacks of the battle was now a blazing wreck. Her career as a fighting ship ended by the same type of dive. Bombers that had destroyed her sisters. Admiral Yamaguchi, recognizing that his ship was doomed, made the decision to go down with her. The samurai tradition demanded that a commander accept responsibility for defeat, and Yamaguchi was determined to follow the ancient code. He ordered his staff to abandon ship while he remained on the bridge, watching the flames consume his flagship. The destruction of the Hiryu marked the end of the Kido Butai, the mobile striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. All 4 Japanese carriers were now burning wrecks, their experienced air crews either dead or scattered across the ocean. The loss represented not just ships and aircraft, but the irreplaceable human resources that had made Japanese naval aviation so formidable. As darkness fell over the Pacific, the scale of the Japanese disaster became clear. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles away, finally grasped the magnitude of the defeat. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their air groups represented a blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. The dream of forcing America to negotiate a favorable peace had died with the carriers. The surviving Japanese ships began their retreat toward home waters, their commanders struggling to comprehend how complete victory had turned into catastrophic defeat in the space of a single day. The mathematics of naval warfare had been rewritten by 5 minutes of American dive bombers, and the strategic initiative in the Pacific had permanently shifted to the United States. The Battle of Midway was over, but its consequences would echo through the remainder of the war. The Japanese command structure, built around the concept of decisive battle and quick victory, had been shattered as completely as their carriers. The rising sun was setting on Japanese hopes for empire, and the long road to defeat had begun. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the chart room of the battleship Yamato, his weathered face reflecting the weight of absolute defeat. The radio reports from the fleeing remnants of the Kido Butai painted a picture of disaster. Beyond his worst nightmares, 4 fleet carriers destroyed, hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew lost, and the strategic initiative in the Pacific permanently surrendered to the Americans. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his superiors that Japan could only fight America for 6 months before industrial capacity determined the outcome, now faced the reality of his prophetic words. The 6 months were up, and the Americans had demonstrated their growing strength with devastating efficiency. The mathematics of war, which had seemed so favorable to Japan in December, had been rewritten by the events of June 4. Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto's chief of staff, approached with the latest damage reports. The Akagi, pride of the Japanese, fleet and flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack, had been abandoned and would be scuttled by her own destroyers, the Kaga, converted from a battleship hull, and one of the most powerful carriers in the world, was also a total loss. The Soryu had already sunk, taking with her the experienced aircrews who had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months. The Hiryu, last hope of the Japanese striking force, was still burning but expected to sink before dawn. With her would go Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, the aggressive commander who had refused to abandon his ship. The loss of such experienced leadership, combined with the destruction of the carrier's air group, represented a blow to Japanese naval aviation that could never be fully replaced. Yamamoto's staff urged him to continue the operation, using the massive battleship force to bombard Midway into submission. The main body, centered around the Yamato with her 18-inch guns, possessed the firepower to reduce the coral atoll to rubble. But the admiral understood what his subordinates did. Not the age of the battleship was over, and carrier aviation now ruled the seas. The American carriers, wherever they were, retained the ability to strike at long range while remaining beyond the reach of Japanese surface guns. The loss of the Kido Butai had left the Japanese fleet blind and defenseless, vulnerable to air attack while unable to respond in kind. The tactical situation had become impossible, and continued operations would only result in further disasters. At 02:30 on the morning of June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that marked the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. Midway operation is cancelled. The words, transmitted to the scattered Japanese forces, acknowledged what every officer already knew: the dream of extending Japan's defensive perimeter had died with the carriers. The retreat toward Japan began immediately, with the surviving ships fleeing westward under cover of